just check that everybody has a hand out. Yep, okay. One of the most basic properties of musical works is that they come to an end. Having begun at a particular point in time, they unfold continuously, and then they conclude. Ideally, we will be absorbed over the duration of our listening experience, meaning that when a piece ends, we will experience a sense of release. After living in musical time, we return to clock time and the normal rhythms of our lives. In the tradition of Western art music, a clear ending point is guaranteed by the fact that this music is captured in written notation. While all sorts of freedoms may be possible in how this musical notation is realised, including a choice of precise tempo, which affects just how long the performance will actually last, the musical experience will be a finite one. But the experience will be more meaningful and involving if the listener has some sense of when the conclusion will come about. To this end, composers will call on various devices that tell us that an end is nigh. Musical elements are manipulated in such a way as to signify impending closure. These elements include, first, falling contours, especially in a melodic line, which so often descends to a point of rest, and these contours imply a relaxation of energy. Secondly, the use of smaller intervals, which often brings in its wake the application of certain ornaments like trills, which also advertise closure. And above all, thirdly, the use of cadences, particular combinations of chordal, melodic, and rhythmic activity that create closure. So just to illustrate that, this is from the first movement of Mozart Violin Sonata, K301, so just a few bars. Two clear phrases there, and in both cases I think closure is made very evident to the listener. So just going back to the first one. So we have a repeated note and then a big leap up, lots of energy. And then from that point we fall. So we not only fall to the end of the phrase, but we do it through small stepwise intervals. And then penultimate note has a trill on it, which also is another help in that regard. And then the next phrase. And from this point again we fall to the end of the phrase. So extensive falling movement, and it's entirely in small intervals, stepwise intervals. And then penultimate note, just to convey that even more strongly. One doesn't need to be highly musically literate to understand these signals. They become absorbed through repeated exposure, creating what we call listening competence. Indeed, we're already primed to understand these signals, since they have much in common with how we impart linguistic information, through the melody of the speaking voice, as it were. In speech too, falling intonation, for example, is used to signal the end of a linguistic unit. And it's important to note that these signals are recursive. That is, they apply not just at the end of a whole piece, but also to endings of sections within a piece. They mean we can gain a sense of where we are at any listening moment, and enable us to grasp stretches of sound as meaningful units. At smaller levels we call these phrases, and then we can move up the scale to speak of sections and ultimately complete musical units. So the Mozart example that I was playing consists of two small-scale units that we can call phrases, both with clear signs of closure. But the point is that the same processes will apply, just on a larger scale, at the level of a whole movement. Within our field of Western art music, though, the clarity of all these signals varies over time. They're perhaps most consistently clear during the period that I've researched most intensively, the music of the 18th century. One dominant way of understanding music as the 18th century progressed was to describe it as a language. To do this suggests a few things: that music is also an agent of communication between people. Both media communicate through sound, and both also take a silent written form. Second, there's an expectation that music is intelligible, that there's mutual understanding between the users of the language. And third, that music is made up of discrete units that build up into larger utterances. So just as words build up into sentences, so notes build up into phrases. The importance of the comparison between music and language is hard for us to grasp, since it's such a familiar idea nowadays, but it was something quite fresh at the time. There had been and would be other ways to understand the nature of music, as celestial sounds, the music of the spheres of earlier times, or music as a primary force, as something that washes over us. But for the 18th century, music was linguistic. In other words, it was a worldly, man-made phenomenon. Johann Joachim Quantz, who's your first quotation on the handout, wrote in a famous flute treatise of 1753 that music is nothing but an artificial language through which we seek to acquaint the listener with our musical ideas. And late in the 18th century, Haydn said, "My language is understood everywhere in the world," which reinforces the importance of this language model to the understanding of music at the time. Further, Haydn suggests not just that music is a language, but that it is a universal one. Again, this has since become a common idea, that music can communicate across the boundaries of different languages, maybe even different cultures. But we should note its novelty at that time. We can place this new sense of music as language within a broader development of a culture in which art music became conspicuously accessible. At no other time was high art music so popular in its accents as it became in the later 18th century, often embracing music that could have been heard on the streets or in the fields. Simplicity and naturalness were buzzwords. The highest compliment one could pay to a piece of music was to call it natural, and there was often a connection drawn between sincerity and simplicity of expression. Simplicity could be thought the highest form of eloquence. Overt complication was suspect. This is the nearest that Western art music has come to some of the popular musical styles of the last 100 years or so, with a strong basis in formula and familiarity. This meant replacing what was perceived as the laborious Gothic writing of earlier Baroque generations with a focus on melody, simply accompanied. The idea was that this corresponded more realistically to what an average listener could take in at any one point in time, as opposed to the endless multiplication of lines in the texture of strict counterpoint. Witness the criticisms of Johann Adolf Scheibe, your second quotation. A composer usually sinks into the bombastic manner when he gives all parts the same amount to do, and when they constantly squabble with one another. This is a not too coded way of referring to the dense contrapuntal textures of Johann Sebastian Bach. The terms of Scheibe's disapproval are significant. The very word bombastic implies a language model. It more or less refers to a manner of speaking down to others. And more broadly, it refers to behaviour, a way of conducting oneself in relation to other people. In fact, it would be a big exaggeration to say that intricate textures disappeared from art music in the 18th century, but it's certainly the case that more accessible melody plus accompaniment textures became common practice. A more important development, though, is that musical utterance becomes organised quite differently. Phrases are now prone to be made up of short, well-defined units, which are clearly signalled to the listener. They're easy to grasp and easy to remember. The very brevity of individual musical units takes us back to the language model. But in particular, it's a language model that tends to the more informal end of the spectrum. To put it in terms that were greatly favoured by the 18th century, it's a model based on conversation. Conversations, after all, tend to consist of quite short exchanges, since, of course, if the individual contributions get too long, the raison d'etre of informal interaction will get lost. A further means of engaging listeners, of serving the goals of creating a more accessible musical culture, was to aim for variety of style. Like naturalness and simplicity, variety was one of the key cultural terms of exchange during the 18th century. This was much harder to achieve within the more continuous style we associate with Baroque musical practice. And just by way of example, I'm going to play a bit of a piece by Francois Couperin, Les Barricades Mystérieuses, from 1717, I believe. So, first of all, just this is how the opening goes. So, a few remarks about this that I think are relevant to our argument. First of all, I think it would be fair to say that rhythmically, this is a very even piece of writing. There's something going on every beat of every bar, so I think we have a strong sense of unbroken motion from beginning to end, because the whole piece is a little bit like those excerpts that I've played. Also, every part of the texture is consistent in what it does, and therefore I think it's pretty clear that whatever this piece offers, variety as such, is not one of those things. Now, you could say that this piece is made up of short units. I've referred to the importance of short units already. So, for instance, here, could say that we're here a short repeated unit here. You could say it's a short little repeated unit. But the important thing here is that there are no gaps in between these repeated units to enable us to hear them as distinct little musical entities. Instead, what I would suggest happens is that those short units merge into a continuum, and so that therefore the overall effect is quite hypnotic, and it's more like what you could call a stream of sound. So basically, what we have is a very even kind of rate of musical progress, and by the end of the 18th century, that would have been pretty much unthinkable. It does happen from time to time, but it's regarded as a special effect to have music that is so even and continuous. So just to be clear, I'm not saying that this piece is deficient in any way. It's a favourite piece of mine. But the point is that for a later generation, it would have been deemed to be lacking in variety, because it offers this extreme continuity of musical process. Now, by way of contrast, we're going to turn to the more modern style that features much greater clarity on the small scale, typically made up of short units with distinct gaps in between. And the term commonly used to describe this is periodic. No previous musical style had featured so many breaks and gaps and short silences, and our Couperin piece effectively features not a single one of them. These breaks and gaps mean that the flow of the music can be easier to grasp. We could call them listener-friendly. It's as if this music is conscious of being listened to, as we can see in the finale of the String Quartet Opus 33 No. 2 by Haydn from 1781. So we're going to listen to this piece, but first of all, just say something about the theme of it. It starts like this. So, here I think is a theme that is clearly constructed of 4 separate units. The first one, and then there's a gap, and then, which is obviously rhythmically the same thing, then there's another gap, and then actually between the 3rd and 4th units, there isn't a gap, there's actually a little linking phrase. I think it's still pretty clear that we've got 4 separate little things happening, and they match. So therefore, this almost has the flavour of a limerick. You could describe it as music that rhymes. Now, it's important that this construction is understood by the listener, otherwise the ending of the piece won't have its effect, and this brings us back to our opening thoughts about musical endings. So just bear in mind the idea that the listener should be able to follow the course of the music, should be able to follow the technique of the music. And Haydn calculates that we'll be able to understand the construction. And in fact, he relies on exactly this assumption. So we're just going to listen to the whole movement now, and you'll hear that that theme that I've been playing, it comes back a number of times, and it's separated by contrasting material. Right, I think it's impossible not to be caught in the act of listening at the end of this movement. I think we feel compelled to keep on listening just in case there is any more music to come. So I'm just going to do a bit of an action replay through the events of the last page or so of this finale. So from this. And there we have short repeated fragments, which are a typical technique used to advertise that the music is in transition. In other words, that we're heading off to something that we've heard before, like a theme or something like that. And in fact, these fragments are the same as the opening of the theme. Which the opening of the theme, remember, is... So it creates anticipation, and then the theme returns. Complete theme followed by a silence. So the movement could perhaps stop at this point. Unlikely, but there is a silence, so it's possible. Then we hear this. So, which is another kind of ending. However, it's a bit of a shock, I think we could say, because the tempo of this material is way slower than anything else we've heard. And also it's completely incongruous. This is material that we have not heard to this point, and it seems to be unrelated. So what we have is quite a grand peroration, quite a grand kind of close. A nice ending, but it would be a nice ending to another piece, not to this piece. It's just kind of stuck in. It's an ending, but it clearly doesn't work. But the important thing is that what follows it yet again is silent, a break. And then we hear, and to this point we've heard the theme an awful lot of times, almost too often. And so we know what's coming next. We know what's coming next. But in fact it doesn't, because what comes next is no sound at all, is silence. And it's a silence that lasts for quite a long time. And then that's followed by, which is what we're expecting to hear, but miles too late. Then we have that second phrase, and that is also followed by a long bit of nothing, basically. And following that, and maybe by this stage we're starting to get the idea that we are going to hear the complete theme, and we're just having these dirty great holes in the middle of it. And that anticipation turns out to be correct. So that's the theme, yet again, but with big silences in between each of the four separate short units. And we've got to assume that that is the end of the piece, because we then have a very long silence. But in fact then we hear, which is, we're programmed to understand that as the beginning of the theme. And therefore we totally know what's coming next, which is more of the same. But in fact, nothing ever happens. And so, at some point after the music stops, we have to accept that what we've heard as a beginning is an end. So just to sort of sum up the argument, it's pretty strange when the four separate units of the movement's theme are performed separately at the end, with the silences in between. Then we have a really long silence and we hear the first unit again. So I think we have to assume we're going to have another elongated performance of the theme. But as the following silence continues, which is not notated in the score, but it's an essential part of the music, we must assume that what we've heard countless times as a beginning, as marking the return of the theme, is in fact to be understood as an ending. And it's the listener alone who must perform this perceptual U-turn. The composer has provided all that he's going to provide. Haydn has basically left the building with a parting message to the listener, which is something like, over to you, you work it out. He effectively forces the listener to interact with the music, to take an active role in making sense of the sounding data. It is a collaborative aesthetic. This movement has given the whole string quartet the nickname The Joke, which seems reasonable enough. But this shouldn't obscure the fact that this is a revolutionary movement. It encapsulates a new approach to the listener. Indeed, a new consciousness that there is a listener out there to be wooed. And it does this by focusing on our basic fact of musical life, that all good pieces must come to an end, so fundamental that no one can fail to engage with it. But because listener response is now elevated to such a prime position, we need not agree even on the basic fact of the music coming to an end. I've outlined one likely response, that we must, even if reluctantly, acknowledge that the piece has finished. On the other hand, one might also feel that this movement contradicts my opening remark, that in the Western art music tradition, pieces are of finite duration. Though the piece has to be taken as having ended, we know full well that it hasn't really done so. It's finished with the first of the 4 units that made up the thing. The sound may have stopped, but the music hasn't. The movement, therefore, in a sense, stretches out into infinity, and it will never be properly completed. Not surprisingly, this movement has been much written about, yet it does not exactly occupy the exalted position I've claimed for it in music history. Why might that be the case? One might argue that it falls victim to an ingrained cultural preference for the overtly serious, one that equates seriousness of tone with seriousness of intention. For instance, we're likely to rank the genre of tragedy higher than that of comedy. The deeper truths, it seems, should be delivered with a straight face. If anything, this preference is even more strongly entrenched in the field of music. We may not be living in music's romantic era anymore, but one could argue that our field is still utterly dominated by what one could call expressive aesthetics, which are most closely associated with the 19th century. Thus, the business of music is to afford expression, which means self-expression, whether on the part of the composer or the performer. And this is closely tied up with notions of personal integrity or authenticity. To do anything else is to court charges of selling out. Within that, we have something of a blind spot in the way we customarily talk of expression in relation to music, and indeed to musical performance. The term tends to denote qualities like introspection, pathos, and melancholy. Logically, all sorts of feelings and moods can be expressed in music, but it now seems deeply rooted in our conception of the art that what we could call reflective depth is the central one, and the one most to be prized. And so anything that represents what we revealingly call the lighter side, anything that seems witty or manipulative, that prompts laughter, that is just a joke, simply can't compete. It can be hard to argue the claims of an art that is not perceived to be properly serious or expressive. This is in fact a problem that extends well beyond the reception of this particular Haydn finale to the wider world of later 18th century music. It remains a common assumption that composers were hamstrung by the conventions of their musical language, by a language that so patently operates with familiar patterns, that aims for the sort of clarity and delivery that I've already outlined, and which so often seems to offer a friendly or humorous tone of voice, as our Haydn finale clearly did. It would seem to fall foul of the equation that the best art is deep, individualistic, expressive, and so on and so forth. Only under special circumstances, it would seem, with a figure of exceptional creative powers such as Mozart, can this inbuilt deficit of the style be overcome. Otherwise, too often the image is of an ephemeral music, simply written to please, to get by in life. Above all, perhaps, lacking a proper ethical basis. My own attempts to address this problem, to try to recuperate later 18th century style on a broader scale, have adopted what I would call a behavioural orientation. This means trying to understand a musical style as implicated in modes of human behaviour, focusing less on individual expression and more on interaction, on the communicative process that is involved. Within that, particular focus has been on what I take to be the sociable ethos of this style. And if you see the handout, the quotations number 3, I've given you there a working definition of sociability. The emotional attributes of sociability include reciprocity, politeness, friendliness, pleasantness, goodwill, graciousness, wit, and humour. Sociability is a means of mediating between individual and collective consciousness. It implies social awareness in a group situation, a feeling of give and take, a desire not to impose oneself too strongly, an awareness of others and of other points of view. The emphasis is on human deportment rather than self-expression. To adopt sociability as a key term of reference by no means implies that the concept of self-expression is absent, nor does it imply that musicians of the later 18th century thought their art was inexpressive. Music was certainly understood as a language of feeling in the 18th century, in fact was constantly referred to as such. But feeling could mean fellow feeling, not just introspection. Sociability was not an opposite to personal feeling or personal expression, but a way of managing them in interaction with others. Further, sociability involves more than defining common emotional attributes of this musical style. It also involves the way the music is organised. The very clarity of phrase structure that I've already outlined is an instance of this, since it attempts to reach out to the widest possible listenership, as if to say, here is music you can understand. You don't need to be an expert to have a stake in this music. And if we zoom out to think about Haydn's finale as a whole, it's clear that he's vividly imagining the social implications, both of the style he uses and of what it means to listen. Take the small gaps between each unit of the movement's theme. These are, as we've seen, an ordinary device of the style, used to promote clarity of listener perception. But, when stretched out, they have a quite different effect, as we could hear when Haydn suddenly left gaps between each component of his theme at the end. They suddenly create an atmosphere of uncertainty. In other words, a break or a pause turns into a silence. The same would apply in an everyday non-musical social interaction. Short breaks in a conversation clarify the process of turn-taking, but if they start to last too long, they turn into awkward silences, and the comfort of a conversational structure turns into a feeling of embarrassment. This kind of embarrassment or uncertainty is surely just what we start to experience during the closing gestures of Haydn's finale. And the most agonising silence of all comes right at the end. What do we do? Who will break the ice? In a live performance of this movement, the ice is like to be broken by the performers by means of gesture. They will indicate that no more music is to come. And this is another level at which Haydn's social conception will operate. All the breaks, pauses, silences, and general oddities of timing in Haydn and in the work of other composers of the time require players to listen to each other much more attentively than before. They must pay very close attention to their performing colleagues in order to coordinate, to stay together through all the breaks. Paying close attention to what others are saying or playing is an intrinsic part of what it means to be sociable. Thus, Haydn's finale inscribes the mutual interaction of three parties: composer, listener, and performer. Now, this will of course be true of any musical performance one cares to imagine, but prior to Haydn, no one had quite thought about it so deeply or imaginatively and built it into the musical script. What does it mean to listen, is the question Haydn asks, in a way that no one had quite framed it before. If Haydn ends with a beginning in his string quartet opus 33 number 2, in our next music example, the finale of another string quartet, the later opus 76 number 5, he begins with an ending. To this point we've concentrated on endings, but beginnings are loaded too for similar reasons. They represent another basic fact of musical life that Haydn is curious about, and they form a natural focus for listener perception. This time, because we move from ordinary time, albeit filled with expectancy as we await the start of the piece, into musical time. How will the piece begin? In the finale of opus 33 number 2, Haydn made us think about the difference between a literal ending and an appropriate ending, and something similar operates at the start of opus 76 number 5. Because it starts like this. So that's the opening of the piece, and it's an exciting start, but as will become clear, I think it's the wrong kind of start. This is material that we should be hearing as an ending. In this case, the composer is relying on our familiarity with a musical formula, one that denotes closure. There are many such formulas in existence to signal an ending, and for good reason, because, as I think our previous pieces reminded us, we listeners like to know when a piece is finished. So again, we're going to listen to the whole movement. Just before we do so, I just want to make a few points just for guidance. So, yes, so the opening of the movement. So the movement begins like that, and it begins because the performers start performing and they produce sound, which is a good sign. And these things tell us that the music has started. But the sounds that we hear immediately signal ending. They signal that the movement is about to close before it's begun. Like so. And therefore there's a basic contradiction between sound and sense. And not only that, but this particular ending formula is, I think, particularly incongruous, in that it would normally come at the end of a long and energetic movement. The alternating chords that we hear are quite sort of grand gestures, and really to have that as an ending formula, you need to work up to it through lots of previous material. The chords, in other words, have to be earned. And so just plonking the chords in at the start of the movement is cheating. Notice also that, in fact, what we don't hear is what I was just playing. We don't hear this. What we hear is this. So that once again we have gaps and in fact silences, and again the silences are very important at the start of this movement. So again we've got the use of silence as what you could call a socially loaded resource of the style. Now you'll hear that Haydn reuses this wrong opening material several times near the start of the movement, but then the point is that it fades away for most of the movement. And what dominates instead is material that illustrates a point I was making earlier on, which is how the art music of the later 18th century often adopted popular accents. So it's this. So this is a fairly extreme example of popular style. I think we've got a real flavour here of some kind of folk music, maybe a wild dance. Certainly, physically, it's very exuberant. It's worth pointing out that such material did not please everyone at the time, and there were certainly listeners who thought that this material was beneath the dignity of art, because basically it's music from the lower orders. Right, now, so what I was saying was that after early on, Haydn deliberately avoids giving us any direct replica of that opening material because he's saving it up for the end of the movement. But what he does do is set up the expectation that it's going to return and then avoids it. So a minute or so into the piece, we'll hear this. It'll be very easy for that to happen, for us to go back to the start. And again, notice we've got these little fragments which create the anticipation that we're about to hear something we've heard before. But we don't get, instead we get. So it's kind of what we might have been expecting to hear, but certainly in the top voice. But everything else is kind of wrong. The chord is completely wrong. That's not the chord we heard at the start of the movement, so it's the wrong harmony, and also this harmony gets sustained. Like so. Then there's a second point where we might expect to hear the opening material, and in fact we do hear it, but it's a problem that Haydn has to wrestle with, because a typical expectation for a large-scale form of this time is that the opening material will come back in the original key. And composers normally make a lot of this. It's a very typical listener-friendly feature that helps us to navigate our way through the listening experience, normally known as the recapitulation. So Haydn needs to have this, but he also needs to underplay it in some way, since he's saving up a full return for the end. So about 2/3 of the way through, you will hear these chords come back, but they're strongly masked by a very brilliant, quick second violin part. So almost as soon as you've heard them, you're distracted by hearing something else, which is more ear-catching. Then, indeed, the chords do finally come back right at the very end of the movement, which constitutes a correction. In other words, having been heard in the wrong place at the wrong time, at the start, they now fulfill their proper function of closing. And so we'll just listen to the whole movement. Go to 76, number 5. So once again here, I think, the listener is virtually forced into an active relationship with the music. Once we recognise the oddity of opening a movement in such a way, we might do a double take, and our attention levels will be raised. The composer has got it wrong, as it were, at the start. How can he put it right? Listeners then get rewarded for paying attention when they recognise the opening chords coming back at the end. And as an extra touch of wit, it's actually not quite the end, as we need 2 extra chords to follow to ground the momentum of the movement. So in other words, we get... it's not quite that, we go... So it turns out that actually what we heard at the start wasn't actually quite that very, very ending. I've argued that in these 2 movements, Haydn is taking just about the simplest aspects of perception that one could imagine, beginning and ending, and using them as a way of initiating a new kind of relationship between music and listener. However, it would be wrong to say that simple is as simple does. Manipulating these fundamental musical events quickly spins off into various kinds of complexity, into all sorts of subtleties and uncertainties of perception. And this is in fact characteristic on a broader scale of later 18th century music, to take something simple and make us listen to it with fresh ears. Thus, listener friendliness was not merely a matter of producing a simpler style of music that was simpler to understand. Drawing the listener in, by the means we've seen in our Haydn finales, makes perception in many ways more demanding. We can't just sit back and let it all flow on over us. Indeed, as instrumental music grew more prominent in the 18th century, there were plenty who felt quite lost by the development, particularly when the style of the music was so varied, when, as we've already seen, the music might change tack from moment to moment. The problem was exacerbated when the music was not anchored by words. A sung text would, after all, tell the listener what sentiment or action was being evoked. And so how to focus listener attention in the case of wordless instrumental music became a celebrated topic of debate. This is precisely, I believe, where the model of music as language comes in. One way of bringing this wordless object to life was to imagine it in linguistic terms, as did the English composer Charles Avison in a preface to a set of instrumental sonatas published in 1760, and this is your 4th quotation. It is rather like a conversation among friends where the few are of one mind and propose their mutual sentiments, only to give variety and enliven their select company. Thus music may be said to discourse and keep up our attention like a methodical and intelligent conversation. Thus music keeps up our attention by being like a language, and in particular, as mentioned before, like a kind of conversation. Note that Avison also mentions variety as a key strategy for maintaining interest. But what happens if, in spite of all these strategies, listeners fail to pay attention? What happens if they get bored? This is in fact a genuine historical question, since there is an argument that boredom only came into existence in the 18th century. More precisely, the literary scholar Patricia Spax has argued that boredom was born in the middle of the 18th century. Now this may seem like a classic academic claim that has no common sense behind it whatsoever. Haven't people always got bored? Haven't they always lost interest in their surroundings or failed to engage with other people or other things? But in fact, the claim is not so much that boredom hadn't been experienced, as that it only became a concept, an acknowledged quantity, around about this time. Spax cites linguistic evidence, noting that in English the verb to bore was first used in the mid-18th century. And in fact, the equivalent noun, boredom, had to wait even longer and dates from the 19th century. And similar tales exist for other European languages. In fact, the very act of bringing attention to the fore as a desirable state, of insisting, for instance, that composers must actively engage their listeners, surely helps to bring its opposite into being. If attention is not secured, then it follows that the outcome will be inattention, or distraction, or boredom. Of course, such a change does not happen purely at a linguistic level. In the case of boredom, it seems to have been encouraged by what we could call the commercialisation of leisure that took place over the 18th century. And this includes another emerging concept that we would now take for granted, and that is the word entertainment. Cultural consumables proliferated and generated a potentially overstimulated state. One example would be the increased production of literary items such as novels. As opposed to an older practice where precious books were read and reread, the new conditions encouraged reading something once and then moving on to the next thing. And that next thing had to be interesting in some way, or else how would one choose it over the many other items that were clamouring to be sold? Instrumental music experienced a similar rise in the marketplace, very commonly being offered in batches of 3, 6 or 12 works, an early form of bulk buying. This means that the stylistic imperatives mentioned earlier, greater listener friendliness, simplification, clarity, variety, could also be said to have arisen from commercial self-interest on the part of composers. This suggests that the new market conditions and new aesthetic goals may have operated in tandem, each working to the benefit of the other. Though this does not sit well with the romantic attitudes outlined earlier, which seem to have been particularly powerful in the case of art music. However, composers were doing more than simply trying to secure listener attention through positive means. Boredom or distraction could also be composed into the music. This often takes the form of the composer seeming to get lost or doing something wrong. And our two Haydn finales have offered examples of things seemingly going wrong or being musically inappropriate. But I'd like to touch on this matter with reference to a very simple musical phenomenon, and that is note repetition. Surely no musical gesture could be more basic, more routine than a simple repeated note. But composers often found ways of making us pay attention to them, thus turning an apparently uninteresting feature, something surely conducive to boredom, into its opposite. Our second Haydn finale has already in fact offered an example of this, with its repeated note drone prominent almost throughout, and I think it goes well beyond accompanimental status and becomes arguably the main expressive agent of the movement. This becomes clearest at those moments when Haydn piles up note repetitions in all parts to create strange harmonies. So just to give you examples of that, from the middle of the piece, we have this. So we've just got simple repeated note. And so they congeal into this very strange sounding harmony. And then something similar a little bit later on. Obviously a strange chord. It's made up of repeated notes, which are a very ordinary musical device, but they become heightened. So basically, the repeated notes get isolated as a musical feature in their own right, and we're forced to listen to them. They're no longer incidental. A different way of accomplishing the same goal can be found in the trio to a string quartet movement by Karl Dittersdorf, and I'm just going to introduce that briefly. And it sounds like this. So again, we've got a very clearly constructed theme made up of short units, short phrase units. And each one concludes with those two repeated notes. Cello. And when the cello takes these over, they sound to me like basically they're a kind of musical filler. That musically the phrase has really finished with that high note. And then this is just, that's just to kind of paced us through to the next proper phrase that's going to begin. So those repeated notes, I think, sound kind of a bit peripheral. So we'll just listen, though, to what happens next. So that bit I was playing gets repeated, and then we move on to the next thing. So dittersdorf. Okay, so what we heard at the end of the first section is immediately echoed. So the cello continues its repeated note on the second and third beats of the bar, but the other players are absent. And the cello continues on its lone path for nearly 4 bars with no intervention from the other voices. So it's a rather strange effect. It's like the cello is not concentrating, or maybe the other participants have dropped off to sleep. There's a definite sense that musically we've lost the plot. So the repetitions may sound aimless, they may sound like the very picture of musical boredom, but at the same time they move what should have been a background figure into the foreground of our listening consciousness. So we've got nothing else to listen to but these. This figure, in fact, turns out not to be a passive filler, because eventually it brings about a change of material, and the other instruments enter with a new figure. And suddenly we've got a completely new style of music, which sounds like a sort of stylized rustic dance. And it's the repeated notes alone that have brought about this sudden change of topic. Thus here, once more, we encounter this characteristic of later 18th century music, to take something simple and make us listen to it with fresh ears. Dittersdorf takes the most uneventful musical material one could imagine, simple repeated notes, and renews our perception of them. In the process, various kinds of unsuspected complexity become apparent. In the case of the current passage, this includes its larger role within the phrase. When we first hear the cello play the repeated notes, they clearly function as an ending to a larger unit. Then, as those 2 notes are repeated, we might start to doubt that label. Maybe they function as a kind of continuation. Maybe they form a new beginning. And do these notes continue to act as accompaniment, as the cello repeats them bar after bar, or have they in fact taken on a more proactive role? These ambiguities are typical of the way composers of the time played around with the edges of a listening experience. A good deal of compositional virtuosity is devoted to these little, simple things. The need to be an active listener seems to be written into the music, and we must presume that listeners responded in kind, or else it's unlikely that such manipulations of musical events would have been continued for several generations. Such active listening represents quite the opposite of a common image today for this music, of undemanding fare for half a tenth of audiences at the start of the concert, a warm-up for performers, a warm-up for the audience. Yet the idea that this music is comfortable and familiar is not wrong. It forms an important part of what I've defined as musical sociability, which implies putting listeners at their ease. But at the same time, the music, as I've tried to show, is demanding and in fact quite elusive. It is both natural and self-conscious. But then this might go for sociable behaviour in general. If we resume the analogy with conversation, the conversation needs to be informal and relaxed in tone, but for it to be successful, a good deal of work is needed behind the scenes, as it were. That includes paying attention. It also includes keeping things fresh. After all, much of a conversation consists of very ordinary words and gestures, and the trick is to deploy these everyday things in such a way that nothing is taken for granted, that even a "hi, how are you" sounds sincere. So it is with the seemingly ordinary routine facts of musical life that I've reviewed, beginnings, endings, and simple note repetitions, as Haydn and other musical figures of his time forged their ethics of audience participation.
so very much, Dean, for that wonderful talk. And I love the way that you were able to show that transgressive things rely on communication and that it was all about the listener experience. I think that is something that perhaps has been lost in subsequent generations of composers and would be great to recover where possible. We generally don't have very much time for questions, but perhaps if there was anyone who had some urgent matters they wanted to raise, we could take maybe one or two brief questions now. Alan.
Thanks very much, Dean. It's a wonderful exposition of what's going on in this music that we often find hard to kind of account for. I was just fascinated by the idea of boredom as having arisen in the mid-18th century. The concept of monotony had certainly been around for a long time beforehand. I'm just wondering if you could say a little about what the difference is. How does monotony as maybe a dislike of too much consistency turn into boredom as a condition of not enjoying it?
Well, I think I mean, I was partly framing it in terms of musical style, but I was also putting it in terms of like a sort of social history as well. And, you know, it's something that is surely evident to us in the current day as well, because we all feel like we're very distracted and there's always something more interesting, you know, around the horizons and over the horizons. I think it's very easy for us, you know, to understand that.
As you were giving us these wonderful examples, I was trying out your explanations on other pieces that do similar things, and being somewhat surprised that you needed a different explanation. And I wondered if you'd like to try it. For instance, the first movement of Beethoven's 8th Symphony, dee-da-dee-da-dum, the beginning is the end.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't by any means have the effect of the Haydn, or to get an extreme example of the music goes on after it's over.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Something like Debussy's Sirène, where the choir is off stage and fading out and then supposed to close the door a little.
Sure, although one could argue that that's an intrinsically more fluid kind of musical language without the same strong expectations of being anchored in tonal practice with short phrase units and stuff, and so therefore it's not as surprising to have a kind of what you could call an open effect. With the Beethoven, yes, absolutely, but I feel that probably Haydn is the one that sets that going, but then every composer has to have a go at the sort of the ending is the beginning kind of thing, and it almost feels like it's a kind of commercial pressure that everyone's got to show that they can do it in some kind of way.
But the Haydn is more shocking than Debussy, because eventually you think, well, there is no more music.
Yeah, yeah. And I do feel that it's an embarrassing situation, you know, and that was one of the important points to try and make, and that he's thinking about that, and I think that's the main point I'm really trying to make, I guess, is just what does it mean to listen, and just you can have great compositional virtuosity using silence and just a handful of notes. If you just think very hard about what does it mean for a piece to start, what does it mean for a piece to finish?
Okay, I think we'll leave the official discussion there, but there will be plenty of opportunities to carry on the conversation over a glass of wine and some nibbles. So when you exit at the back of the hall, just turn to the left, there are drinks and some nibbles at the bar, so please come and join us there. But can I ask you just to join me once again and thank you, Dean, for a fantastic talk.